Hello there, people.
Hello, hello.
Hello. It's Ron Coleman and his son, Rabbi Usher Coleman, coming in from California, where it's dry and beautiful.
Too
Alto,
dry.
California. Too dry, right? That's the problem over there.
That is the perennial problem.
We're going to talk
Our
about
forests
problems.
are too dry. Our aquifers are too dry. It's trouble everywhere.
If it's not one thing, it's another.
That's what they say.
And perhaps we'll be able to fit that into our theological or historical or wide-ranging discussion tonight. I thought it would just be now that I've got a few people who like to listen to me that have been established listeners too, it seemed to me that it would just be a darn shame if I couldn't expose some people who I know that I get a lot of feedback here. When I say here, I mean right here in my room in Clifton, New Jersey.
I believe it.
Through the magic of the Ethernets about the ways and the thought ways and think ways and sensibilities of the Jewish people. And I'm going to those people. I'm going to be kind of getting, there's going to be a lot of absent spots in the coming month. And Rosh Hashanah is next Tuesday and Wednesday. But for that reason, I thought, first I was thinking, well, maybe I'll say a few words about Rosh Hashanah. And then I said, that would really be presumptuous of me because I may very well be better qualified to say those words than most of the people within the sound of my voice. But there are people who are far better qualified than I. And I started going through my mind of the names of all the rabbis that I know, real rabbis, so-called rabbis and otherwise. And it occurred to me, I think I know somebody who might have actually some interesting things to say about Rosh Hashanah and maybe can answer some questions that I genuinely can ask because I don't know the answers to this. So I introduce to you in his world, internet, broadcast, and otherwise debut, Rabbi Asher Coleman. What do you do for a living, Mr. Coleman, Rabbi Coleman?
What do I do for a living? So I work for a nonprofit organization here in the Bay Area, California. It's known as, here's the plug, Jewish Study Network, headed by none other the great Rabbi Joey Felsen. Our purpose is, I am actually reciting the motto. The motto of our organization is raising the level of Jewish literacy in the Bay Area. The Bay Area is home to something in the neighborhood of 500,000 Jews. That number has almost lost all significance because of how disconnected many of these Jews are from their heritage. There are a lot of kind of alt versions of the heritage that are floating around here, and I don't want to, talk about school, but it's not the real thing. And there's a very, I would say, aggressive and ambitious effort that we've been doing before I joined the organization just a couple of years ago. The organization's around for about 20 years, trying to hold together the remnants of that population. There are nodes of people who are still observant traditional Orthodox Jews who have always been here.
Always?
Yeah, well, always. Since the 70s, since the 60s and 70s.
Yeah, that's pretty much.
As Stanford grew in prominence and then subsequently with the tech industry, you got nodes of Orthodox Jews. And in the last 10 or 15 years, a wave of Israelis, first high-tech Israelis, and interestingly now, not in Palo Alto, but more in the surrounding areas, which are a little less expensive, you have a wave of Israeli blue-collar workers, people who work in construction. So there is this, there's a surprisingly large market for real, serious, in-depth Jewish content. So that's what we try to provide.
Very good. And how did you prepare for this job of yours of providing this content, as we call it on the internet?
So coming up, I talked a lot.
I don't know. I had the same experience that it did not end up.
Me talking a lot, right? And
well,
so I combined that with a love of reading and of learning, which everyone can see from my father's background, I didn't come up with myself.
Those are his books.
So I do recognize a good number of them. I see the Reagan book, I see the Adams book. moving on to, as I did from the high school age and on, I moved into the world of the traditional, what are known as the Lithuanian yeshivas, because a yeshiva is a school of traditional higher Jewish education, right? It's not like a Hebrew school where you learn Hebrew and you learn to pray and things like that. When you show up at a yeshiva, the assumption is you know how to pray, how to daven, you know how to read, and now you're going to be taught how to think and how to pursue higher, more really elite levels of devotion and service. And I was in some ways very well prepared, in some other ways ill prepared for that experience. And I was given the opportunity to study and to develop the traditional techniques of study, which unfortunately very few Jews today are afforded. And that enabled me to do serious work, which I am fortunate to be able to do to this day. Not everyone gets to well into their 20s, almost their 30s, pursue higher Jewish learning. There are no big grants. There are very few big grants. There are some, but there are no big grants for this sort of thing. And so I'm very fortunate to be able to do this in an environment where, in exchange for giving to the community when I can, I'm allowed to pursue my own studies most of the day. And so that's really the answer as to how I got where I got. Is I did the traditional thing, and I also am quite accustomed to shooting my mouth off.
Well, I think you're past the point of shooting your mouth off.
Yeah, no one can stop me now.
Okay, so with that introduction, I would say that I'd like to get into the topic I promised everybody, which is to explain what Rosh Hashanah is. As I put it in sort of my subtitle, which you probably haven't seen because you're being busy and not being on the internet. The question I asked was, well, I made a pun, as I tend to do. What's the rush? What kind of New Year is this? There's no champagne. There are no streamers.
Right.
No old acquaintance being forgot. Quite to the contrary, in fact. Why do the Jews do all this moping around the time of New Year, and where do we find this in the Torah, in the Bible? Where's the Rosh in the index? I didn't find Rosh Hashanah. Correct.
The phrase Rosh Hashanah doesn't appear. I'm not the kind of person, like I have relatives who actually know the whole Chumash. It's like an open book in front of them.
Chumash, the Pentateuch.
Read through the Chumash, as everyone does.
Chumash, the Pentateuch, the 5 books of Moses.
Yes, the 5 books of Moses. Right. So I have not. I'm not one of those people who can recite verbatim passage after passage from the Bible, but
we're deeply ashamed of you for that reason.
Right, of course. But based on as a friend of mine likes to say, so I have a friend who I'll give him a shout out. He's history courses on Twitter, Abraham Ash, and someone once asked him on there, I think it was a Christian fellow, something about something relating to the importance of the Bible in Judaism. And he's like, it's not really our main book. We're really more about the Talmud. And I was like, Avram, you're basically right. We wouldn't say that because ultimately it is the literal written divine word, but most of our, my study time is focused on the ancillary literature, like the Talmud.
In other words, he said the part you're not supposed to say.
Yeah, he's good at that. He's good at that. And so follow him. He's cool. But anyway, so the only reference, the phrase Rosh Hashanah appears really, really late in the Bible. It's in the prophets, in the prophet Ezekiel, Yecheskel, and it doesn't seem to, based contextually, does not seem to refer to what we call Rosh Hashanah. By the way, the phrase Rosh Hashanah literally means the head of the year. Rosh Hashanah. So you'll hear my father and myself, we're using, because we're Ashkenazic Jews from a fairly traditional, in my father's case, ethnically very traditional, and in my case also because I came up in a yeshiva environment, which is very, very uber conservative. So we don't use the modern Hebrew pronunciation. We'll use the what's called the Ashkenazic pronunciation. So we'll say something like Rosh Hashanah, which is grammatically a nightmare, but it's actually the way that Jews said those words for, at some point over the centuries, it blended into that grammatical nightmare. But what it means is Rosh Hashanah, right? It's the head of the year. It's the beginning of the year. And so it doesn't seem like that's what the prophet's referring to there based on the context clues. And what's very interesting is that in an agrarian society, which is what the ancient Israelites were, you might think that the Rosh Hashanah maybe is the season in which you plant or the season in which you harvest. But Rosh Hashanah actually really isn't that. It kind of falls in between. It's a little bit in advance of the holiday of Sukkot, which is the end of the farming season, right? It's when you go inside it. It comes right before the winter. So what we're actually kind of doing is we're really closing out the year at Rosh Hashanah. But in the Torah, in
other words, in contradistinction to the name, which suggests
the beginning of the year, we're actually we're kind of closing out the year. And so you mentioned, where's the party? So we do have a Rosh Hashanah, which is a party, right? And there's a Mishnah. The Mishnah is, I mentioned the Gemara before, the Talmud, which is what I spend most of my day working on. But the Mishnah is actually the core text around which the Talmud is built. So we have the Torah, we have the written Torah, the 5 books of Moses. And on that, there's the Mishnah, which is this very concise and compressed corpus. That was a completely inadvertent alliteration. Concise and compressed corpus of quotations and almost descriptions of disputes, and it's not always disputes. That's a stereotype. Sometimes it's just straight facts, from which we derive what we call the oral Torah. Now it's funny because we're talking about a text. It's books on my shelf, right? But there was a time up until, really in a certain sense still, but up until about 2,000 years ago, when the only way you could access these teachings was by memorizing them at the feet of a master. And that would be something that you would do as a child. And then if you were intellectually gifted, you'd know that corpus. And then if you had the ability or the wealth or whatever to continue down that path, you would engage in the practice which we call Gemara or Talmud, which is the practice of dissecting, of figuring out these cryptic, compressed statements and what are they really about. And it is something you can spend your entire life, multiple lifetimes, doing. It is a massive, massive corpus. So when the Mishnah, there's a tractate of the Mishnah, which is called Rosh Hashanah. And it is, to my knowledge, the first description of Rosh Hashanah is Rosh Hashanah, because it's all about Rosh Hashanah. And it opens by saying there's actually 4 Rosh Hashanahs. Arba Rosh Hashanah. There are 4 Rosh Hashanahs, right? There are 4 beginnings of the year, and actually most of them are beyond the scope of what we're talking about. But if you want to know which one we celebrate in, that's the one that starts in Nisan. The month of Nisan is whenever the Torah talks about the order of months, it's counting from Nisan. Nisan is month 1, and that's laid out as before the Jews even really leave the land of Egypt, right before the Exodus. The first mitzvah, the first commandment we receive is this month, and it was the month of Nisan because that's when Pesach happened. This month is for you.
What's Pesach?
Pesach is Passover.
Okay.
Right. This month is for you the first of months. So the celebration that we observe in Nisan, also known as Pesach or Passover, that's the party. Now, it's not the kind of debased party that the society around us seems to favor, in which you are supposed to find some stranger to shack up with for the night. It's kind of a more exalted and traditional thing, in which you are in which one is supposed to gather with his family and celebrate and sing and praise God. But that's the celebration. Rosh Hashanah is something quite different. The Rosh Hashanah, which is coming now, which is coming on Tuesday and Wednesday. That Rosh Hashanah in the Torah is described not as in any way the first of anything, but what it is described as is like this. Oh, here it is. Here's how it goes. So this is in Leviticus 23. Leviticus 23:23, actually. Chav Gimel. Right, God spoke to Moses, saying, speak to the children of Israel, and in the 7th month, on the first day of the month, right, on the 7th month, on the first day of the month. If we count from the month of Nisan, Tishrei which is the month which is about to come, the first day of Tishrei is Rosh Hashanah, that's the 7th month. On the first day of the month, what should you do? You shall observe complete rest. So first of all, it's established that is what is called a Shabboson. A Shabboson, that might remind you, if you're familiar with the Hebrew word, Shabbos, Sabbath. What Rosh Hashanah is first and foremost is a Sabbath. It is a day on which we do not do prohibited categories of labor. So people who know my father know that he logs off. Right? He says, "Good Shabbos," and he posts a picture of the sunset on Fridays. Why does he do that? Because Orthodox Jews do not use electricity. Now that doesn't mean we don't have lights on, but we do not actively use electricity or use computers or drive in cars on Shabbos. So the hot take factory must close up for Shabbos, and just as it must close up for Shabbos, it's in the Bible. I don't make the rules. There are no hot takes permitted on Rosh Hashanah either.
I mean, there are plenty of hot takes.
There are plenty of hot takes,
but just not on the internet.
Right. So on Rosh Hashanah, so that's like a symbol right away to us, right? That's a signal, I should say, right away to us. What are we doing? There are many events, by the way, in the Jewish calendar that don't require a Shabbos, that don't require a work stoppage, not to be confused with a work stoppage. But there are plenty of things. You know, we have Rosh Chodesh, the beginning of every month. We don't refrain from, a lot of drive on Rosh Chodesh. We have Chanukah, Purim. We got all kinds of things. We pray 3 times a day. We're not prohibited from driving to shul, but there are days in which we're supposed to kind of pull back. And the most significant thing, again, it's always important to kind of reframe ourselves in agrarian terms, which is very hard. You may have heard about the Industrial Revolution and its consequences, and what exactly they've meant for the human race.
They have that in California also?
Oh boy. but anyway, when we say, all right, pull back from the world, stop sowing, stop planting, stop digging, all those things, what that means is that what that signals to the believing man is that this is a moment to recenter your, I don't know if it's right to call it your value system, it's more your whole frame, the way in which you engage with the world, and pull it back a little from your personal achievements, from the things that you do in the real world. That's the first thing Rosh Hashanah is. We got a lot of days like that throughout the calendar, including once a week on Saturday and Shabbos. That's the first thing it is. The second thing it is a 2-word phrase, which elsewhere in the Torah, only one of these words gets used, and that is Zichron Teruah. Zichron Teruah literally means a remembrance. Some people want to translate this. The translation I have in front of me says a sacred occasion. I don't love that. It's maybe a convocation. Teruah literally means loud blasts. So they say here a sacred occasion commemorated with loud blasts. So those loud blasts might be making you think, as they should, of what is most kind of iconically associated with Rosh Hashanah. What's interesting, though, before I get to that, which is kind of, like I said, it is in the popular imagination, the thing that Rosh Hashanah is most focused on, is that the earliest commentator on, this is my Chumash, on the Pentateuch, on the 5 books of Moses. Chumash means the five thing, the 5-part thing. It is the word Pentateuch, and the word Chumash. Pentateuch is a direct translation of the word Chumash, and so the word, the earliest commentator or explicator of the 5 books of Moses was a convert to Judaism named Onkelos. Onkelos seems to have been a Roman. He seems to have also been an expert linguist. He translates the entire Torah into Aramaic. Why does he do that? Well, a fact that is little known is that the vernacular of the Jewish people historically, and for like a very long time, until the early Middle Ages, was Aramaic, not Hebrew. Hebrew was a language which you might in fact not know if you were not learned. You spoke Aramaic because the Jewish people are Arameans. We are from Aram, which is modern day southern Turkey and northern Syria. And we take no responsibility for anything that's going on there now. We left a while ago, but obviously we did not, leave people we can be particularly proud of behind us. So because it's been a mess, but We speak Aramaic. That's our mother tongue. And that's why the Talmud is written in Aramaic. The Zohar, which is the most important work of Jewish mysticism, is written in Aramaic. And the translation of the Chumash of the Bible into Aramaic was, the purpose of that was to enable the people, hoi polloi, to understand the holiest book of the Jewish canon, because there was a problem. People didn't get it. People didn't know what was going on. And so that's why what you would do was you would read the Torah in public, and then there would be a live translation. Right? There would be a guy with a really loud voice who would get up and bellow out the translation in Aramaic. And to this day, in the Yemenite community, they still do this, although they switched to Arabic at some point, if I'm not mistaken, understandably. So Onkelos is thus one of the oldest and most authoritative commentators on the Torah, but your Aramaic has to be pretty good, and your general rabbinic knowledge has to be pretty good to know what he's getting at, because he's a really, really precise translator. And he translates that word that we mentioned earlier.
Where was he coming? What was his ethnic background? Was he?
Onkelos, as I mentioned, he was a Roman.
He was a Roman.
Tradition.
So he would have known Latin and Greek. Those would have been his.
Presumably, correct. And he, as a convert living in the land of Israel, at some point not only did he pick up Aramaic, but he developed great proficiency in Aramaic. I mean, his Aramaic is the gold standard. It doesn't get better than Onkelos' Aramaic for, early. I think it's called classical era Palestinian Aramaic,
which is what we do not find in the Talmud.
Well, right. The Talmud is written in actually what is known to this day as Babili, which is Babylonian. It's really Syriac, Babylonian Syriac. These are all people are going to fall asleep. But
guess what? I'm not sure anyone's listening but you and me. So that's just a conversation.
Well, anyway, so Onkelos translates the word teruah, right? That word, which we said as loud blast. He translates it as Yevava. And Yevava, while it can mean something along the lines of loud blasts, it also kind of implies wailing. It implies a certain degree of distress. And that kind of is already a clue, a very ancient, a mid-Second Temple era clue to the idea that Rosh Hashanah, that the Jewish New Year, is a somber time. It's a solemn time. And of course, the literal translation of the word teruah is generally taken to be a reference to this. I brought my props, right? The chauffeur. This is a chauffeur. This is actually a pretty good chauffeur. I'm not going to blow it because my kids will wake up. It's very loud. But the prop that people associate, I think, most readily with Rosh Hashanah is the shofar, which is blown. We blow 100 shofar blasts.
What is it? What is that? What is it?
The shofar is, well, as you can see, it is an animal horn.
I'm from Brooklyn. If you think I ever grew up seeing one of those things walking around in the streets on East 12th Street and Neptune Avenue.
Oh, they were there. They were just in the halal slaughterhouses. But I don't have any goog on, as you can see. I need some. But this sticker tells us that it is a kosher shofar. It is not plastic. It is not an imitation. That doesn't mean that I'm going to eat it. That's
so it's a ram's horn that's what hollowed out.
Yes, it is. It is hollow, but that's not the end you blow through. Right. This is the end you blow through, and like I said, I'm not going to do this. It'll wake up the neighborhood, but it produces a very powerful sound, and it's something of a skill. I think anyone who's played a wind instrument knows that wind instruments are something that have a bit of a learning curve. But since there are no notes on the shofar, once you get it, you get it. You don't have to know music. You just have to know how to blow into a wind instrument. But it is generally assumed that it is to this the Torah refers when it says, do a teruah. Do blasts, right? Make blasts as you on the day of Rosh Hashanah. And it's not surprising, therefore, that people associate this as the primary thing of Rosh Hashanah. And that's really all the Torah tells us to do. Refrain from prohibited labor, so don't work the land, and go blow your trumpet. But as we noted, there are these little hints that there's a little more there. There's concealed beneath this kind of innocuous, like, oh, it's a day in which you blow a horn.
You mentioned the Yom Zikaron, right?
Exactly. There's another part. right? Rosh Hashanah is also the Yom HaZikaron. This should not be confused with the Israeli civil holiday of the same name, right? Because Yom HaZikaron can be construed as, it can be read as in modern Hebrew as Memorial Day. And Israeli Memorial Day is called Yom HaZikaron. And that's a different thing. That's a recent invention. We are talking about Rosh Hashanah as the Yom HaZikaron, the day of remembrance. What do you mean the day of remembrance? Who's remembering stuff? God's remembering stuff. And this is how we get into the rabbinic characterization of Rosh Hashanah as the day of judgment. And
So
this is
the day of remembrance. Day of remembrance would be the literal translation.
right.
If you go to the left, so to speak, you get Memorial Day.
Right.
And if you go to the right, so to speak, you have a day of judgment.
Right.
Okay, so remembrance alludes to this idea that there's accountability. One of my favorite hashtags, no accountability. This is not the no accountability situation. This is the
exactly.
yes accountability.
Hashtag journalism. But here's the thing, and this is, I think, this really shines a spotlight, both to a certain degree, it shines a spotlight on the Jewish-Christian dialectic, but to frame it more in modern terms, it shines a spotlight on the godless versus godly dialectic. There are a lot of people out there who will be very eager to tell you that the traditional practices of Judaism are some kind of rabbinic revisionism. There's some kind of later invention. They come from the Second Temple period. They reflect some greater societal, to me, this is like the oldest anti-Semitic conspiracy theory. There's a cabal of rabbis who are falsifying texts and manipulating the public to get them to do things for their own power. So, this is like the premise of 19th century Bible scholarship, and it's incredibly inane, especially if you know anything about history. If you know how absolutely uninfluential the rabbis were at the end of the Second Temple period. They were something. They were on the radar. Like Josephus does dedicate some of his book to talking about them, but they were just one of many factions in the city of Jerusalem, all of whom claimed to be the true Jews. From the Hellenizing Sadducees to the extremist Essenes to there was a whole kind of spectrum of somewhat Hellenized but still Judaic. And when I say Hellenized, Roman culture just kind of fastened itself onto Greek culture. They culturally appropriated just about the whole thing, soup to nuts, and they were like, but it's Roman now. And they basically swallowed up what was formerly the Greek Empire and made it Roman. And so there were many Jews who were Roman citizens in good standing, which meant that they were full of Greek culture, and who were also what we would call kind of observant Jews. And they were interested, they were connected to the rabbis, but they weren't quite the rabbinic Jews. And when we talk about Jewish communities today, it's a mistake to say, there's a large community of affluent Jewish professionals in New York. That's just like Alexandria. It's like, not really, even though Alexandria was a city full of affluent Jewish craftsmen, right? But they weren't observing Judaism exactly like a devout Orthodox Jewish professional today might, because a lot has happened between then and now. So you can kind of see where the impetus comes from to say this is all a plot by some rabbis, except that it doesn't make any sense because there's no motive. It didn't gain them anything. All they gained was abuse. They lived in poverty and misery. But they believed, and we believe as holders of that tradition, that this was the right way to practice Judaism. Now, inherent to that theology is that Jews must do some things and must not do other things. And I know that's a very controversial topic, but yes, there are things we have to do and things we have to not do. And that's most of the religion.
Wait a minute, though. Let's take a step back. Aren't the holidays really just about people,
about
family,
being kind,
and food?
Good
family
food.
And food.
Yes.
That's my understanding.
Right, and the Goyim tried to kill us, right? Isn't that usually so? It turns out that that's also not quite it. Although although it should be noted, in seriousness, right? We, of course, celebrate all of our holidays with the exception of Yom Kippur, which is not that kind of holiday. We celebrate all of our holidays with feasting, right? We do feast, we do get together with family, we do celebrate, but we're not celebrating celebration, right? We don't actually ever celebrate family or celebrate love. If, God forbid, I have dear friends who don't have families yet, right? They're single, they live alone in apartments in New York. They're also going to observe these holidays, right? They're not opting out. Oh, well, I don't really have a family, so I suppose I'll just, go to Shake Shack. No, that's not right. That's not how this is done. We're fortunate that, certainly in New York, there are Jewish communities. It's very difficult to live as an Orthodox Jew outside a community. And, you may be invited to someone's home if you don't yet have your own family. But it's the family enhances the festival experience. The festival primarily has a particular theological goal. Now, so what is that theological goal? Well, let's think about it. We've shown that it's the holiday, it's the day of remembrance. We know that there's a list of things Jews ought to do and ought not to do. If we are being remembered, if there is a yearly event during which remembrance occurs, it stands to reason that what is remembered before God is, well, have we done what we're supposed to do or not? Right? If it is the year, it's the day on which we remember, that implies a look back. We're doing a year in review. In a year in review, why do people look over the past year? Why do CEOs do earnings calls? How have we done? How have we done so far? Well, here's the deal. Hopefully good, but maybe not so good. And that is really the whole story of what is known today in the Orthodox world as the Elul season. And that is the month, Elul is the month before Tishrei, it's the month before Rosh Hashanah, in which traditionally devout Jews examine their actions. And they spend time thinking to themselves, well, how have I been doing? What kind of Jew am I? People try to do extra things that traditionally in Eastern Europe, and I believe this was the case in more ancient Jewish communities, people would leave their homes for Elul. Even businessmen, people who worked for a living, they would, during this season, they would leave their homes for weeks at a time even. They would travel maybe to, if they were Hasidic, they would travel to the court of their Rabbi, the religious leader, who was the inspiration of their particular Hasidic group. If they were not Hasidic, they might travel to one of the great yeshivas, one of the great traditional schools in which they might have studied as a young person. And they would take this time for spiritual improvement. They would remember, as God will remember on the day of judgment, what have I done and what can I do better?
And was there consensus did everyone agree about what the standards were, about what they should be doing and not doing? Or was it really something that you have to feel yourself? You have to know, you decide for yourself what's going to be, your form of observance.
Right. So the question I know what you're getting at, but I'm gonna address what you're actually saying, and then I want to actually jump off of that to a similar.
I'm giving you the open door here.
So what obviously what my father's getting at is that there is a phenomenon, and it's not a new phenomenon, but it is a very popular phenomenon now, which privileges, if I had to describe it in a nutshell, it privileges the forward look over the backward look. So much more than we consider, than some people consider it important to introspect, they consider it important to kind of madly headlong forward. And whatever it is that pulls them forward, they are pulled by that thing. Because without introspection, it's very hard to know what your drives are. Introspection, by definition, calls for some objective standard to which you compare yourself, right? Someone who doesn't have an objective standard does not have to introspect, right? So if you, like a certain former president, define sin as being out of alignment with your values, you're just, we have Yiddish expressions for what you're doing, but you're saying foolish and nonsensical things. Because if you define sin as when I'm not happy with what I've done, there's a very simple solution to sin, which is become happy with what it is you've done. So introspection by definition calls for some objective standard. And of course, what my father's getting at is that the objective standard is Torah law. The objective standard is what we believe to be the law which was handed down by Moses at Sinai, and that governs really the minutest details of how we live our lives. And so the easiest breakdown of what it means that Rosh Hashanah is the Day of Judgment is, I have a book, I have books on my shelf which tell me what I'm supposed to do every day, and we're just making sure I'm fulfilling all those protocols.
And did everyone in Jewish history have the ability to read all those books that you have on that shelf there and understand what their religious obligations were? I mean, that sounds like a really demanding kind of thing. I mean, that I had to spend a couple of years just to learn the most fundamental basics of what were in those books, and I was already an adult, and you spent your childhood, being acquainted with them. But I mean, as you mentioned earlier, not everyone has the benefit of that kind of educational opportunity. So what do people do when they're not so well acquainted with all those fine details and Rosh Hashanah? How do they know what to look back on?
Exactly. So that's a very good question. And
yeah, I think it is really good. I'm very happy with that question.
it relates, in a way, it relates more to Yom Kippur, right, which is the day in which we ask forgiveness for sins. That's more where you need this very specific knowledge of what yes and what no, and have I fulfilled those obligations? And that probably should shed a lot of light on why a lot of what we spend time doing on Yom Kippur is reciting a litany of sins. I've done this. I've done that. Al Chet, right? We say Al Chet. God forgive me for the sin that I have done by X. When we fill in the blank with pages, and there are people who say extra ones that are even longer because of exactly what you just described. Not everyone knows.
But we don't do this on Rosh Hashanah, which is the day of judgment.
Don't do that on Rosh Hashanah.
But it's the day of judgment. So how can we
the day of
have
judgment.
this retrospective? We're doing an audit, right? It's like an audit, or that's the audit is on Yom Kippur.
Yeah, exactly. So that's the tricky thing.
Oh, okay.
You're killing it. That's the tricky thing. That's the
narrator. He knew the answers to most of the questions he was asking Rabbi Coleman, but still wanted to hear how Rabbi Coleman would answer.
Right.
Who is more erudite than he?
So there's a little play we do in this period, and it's confusing because we talk a lot about repentance after Rosh Hashanah. After Rosh Hashanah. We talk about what the focus of Rosh Hashanah is in a moment, but we talk about repentance after Rosh Hashanah, because Rosh Hashanah, even more than it seems to be an impetus to repentance, to repentance in advance of Rosh Hashanah, it seems to be something which should drive our desire for repentance as a result, almost, of Rosh Hashanah. And there's a traditional teaching which illustrates this, where we say, if someone is completely righteous, so when Rosh Hashanah, the day of reckoning, the day of judgment comes, right? So the heavenly court looks at him, they're like, wow, look at this guy. He's great. He's a tzaddik, right? He's perfectly righteous. And he gets written into the book of life, the book of life. Now, that doesn't mean that anyone who's a sinner is going to drop dead. What it means is that there's a kind of life, which is life, and there's a kind of life, which is death. And the righteous person is written into the book of life. Right? If it were true that sinners drop dead instantly, there would be no sinners. And I can assure you that there are sinners. But the truth is that most of us are sinners. The question is just how much. And this is acknowledged by the rabbinic teaching that I'm quoting, which says, well, what if you're a Beinoni? What if you're just a regular guy? Right? You're a guy who, whatever, you do your best. Sometimes you do well, sometimes you fail. Well, then, your judgment is held in abeyance until Yom Kippur. In other words, the slot between Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, which is 10 days, actually, if you include Rosh Hashanah, it's a total of 10 days, it's a little over a week of in-between days. That's really the spot where repentance happens. Repentance is where you look yourself over and say, I've done all these things wrong. And that's why, like I said, on Yom Kippur, you're going to go through in detail all these various things you've done wrong. And you're going to ask forgiveness. That's not looking forward. That's looking backward. On Rosh Hashanah, even though we call it the day of remembrance, what we're really going to do is make commitments going forward. That's really our job. And that's why we're allowed to approach Rosh Hashanah in such general terms. We don't have to yet get into the details of what have I done wrong. We need to talk more about what will I do right. And these are much more big ticket items. And they can loosely be broken down into one general concept. And that is the concept of coronation. And we know, in fact, that there was an early mystical group, Ashkenazic mystical group in the 12th and 13th centuries in Germany, who were called the Hasidei Ashkenaz, the Hasidim, the pious of Ashkenaz, which is just the Hebrew word for the land surrounding the Rhine. That's not to be confused with the modern designation of which people are more familiar with, Hasidic or Hasidim, while there's definitely some affinity in terms of
you're not referring to Ashkenazim now, you're referring to Hasidei Ashkenaz.
Right.
Hasidim of Ashkenaz did not mean guys with
necessarily.
Right. You don't really know what they look like.
Who live in Borough Park and do diamonds, right? That's not the thing. This was a group of ascetic mystics. They spent their time composing incredibly complex mystical poetry and observing very, very stringent interpretations of Jewish law, but they also are responsible for some of the most important theological concepts and expressions that end up kind of constituting the way that the Ashkenazic worldview evolves, even though they pretty much vanish after a century or two as an active movement, but their thought leaves this lasting impact. And they used to call Rosh Hashanah, their shorthand for Rosh Hashanah was Coronation Day. On Rosh Hashanah, we crown God as the king of the world. And if you take a look, if you read Hebrew, even if you don't read Hebrew, you can read a translation at the prayers that we say on Rosh Hashanah, which are the main focus of the day. The prayers we say on Rosh Hashanah all revolve around this theme of crowning God. Now, it goes without saying that if we are crowning God our king, we intend to do exactly what he says we ought to do and not do anything he says we ought not to do. That goes without saying. We're going to get into those details in between now and Yom Kippur. Rosh Hashanah is a big picture day. Rosh Hashanah is, we're pledging allegiance, and we pledge allegiance in a heartfelt fashion, traditional, and emotional fashion, but it's not meant to be a depressing day. It's meant to be a serious but uplifting day. That's the Jewish New Year, which Rosh Hashanah is.
So, why do I have to spend all day in synagogue for this? I understand everything you said, and I'm sure it's a lot of work, but why do I have to get up earlier than usual? And I love to get up early and spend what's the morning, 5 hours, 6 hours?
Easy. Mm-hmm.
Easy, depending on just what kind of service it is and what kind of community it is.
Right.
Go home for a meal, barely time to rest, back to synagogue, and then let's not talk about do it again. Maybe before we finish tonight, we'll talk about why there are 2 days of Rosh Hashanah. But why all this business? What is all the business? What do the Jews do all day in the synagogue?
So that's yet another very good question, which sometimes I ask myself. Some
of our best rabbinic friends have asked the same question very conspicuously.
So the answer really is that there's a tremendous amount of things to do on Rosh Hashanah in terms of observances and in terms of liturgy. Not least among them is the blowing of the shofar. We blow 100 shofar blasts over the course of the Rosh Hashanah prayers. That adds up to a shofar blast. Doesn't just mean toot. There are 3 different varieties of them. They're complex. They take time, and they're done in perfect silence because no one's supposed to. You're supposed to hear nothing but the shofar. So that in and of itself chews up easily a half an hour plus. If you just extract all the shofar blowing, maybe more, half an hour, 45 minutes. The prayer services are also very, very long because we have this beautiful accumulation of poetry liturgical poetry, which has attached itself to the service over the years, from some of the poets who were whose work we recite, and we don't today. Almost nobody recites all the poetry, but the selected poetry we do recite was written by great rabbinical scholars, linguists, and grammarians. And what it's all about is, in a world before multimedia, and this is still true. Multimedia is just kind of this gross slab that has flopped down on top of the world of human experience. But in the world before multimedia, the way that people communicated emotion and devotion was with literature and with verse. And so the best way to make the prayers inspiring and uplifting was to pull back a little on the formulaic nature of prayer. Prayer by definition gets a little formulaic, and to infuse it with poetic spirit by reciting, and really we're talking about some of the most beautiful poetry of the Jewish liturgy, deeply moving and deeply devotional in its expression. And the purpose of it is to engender in the heart of the believer inspiration towards the goal of crowning the king. And that's why there are ancient melodies, some of which are preserved for centuries, some of which were preserved for millennia. We are very particular about not changing those tunes. There are certain things where we do allow popular tunes, and there are things which we say you're not allowed to change that. When the prayer leader, no matter how musically creative he is, he needs to do certain things just the same way that they've been being done for really very much for centuries. And what that's all about is we're trying to hold on to this moment of this height of spiritual inspiration, which Rosh Hashanah traditionally represented. This probably explains why many Jews who are not otherwise affiliated with the Jewish community find themselves back in shul on Rosh Hashanah. There's a deep and profound pull.
What's shul? Where does this word shul come from? I hear the Jews say it all the time.
So shul literally means school. It is I think, if I'm not mistaken, to this very day in Germany, the shul is the word for school. School is the word for shul, if you want to put it that way. But it is in Yiddish, it means synagogue. It is such a common word that I would say, I think it has gained its place in modern Hebrew. I hear Sephardic Jews say shul. It's a normal thing for them to say. But even Jews who are not otherwise traditional find themselves back in shul on Rosh Hashanah. And part of that is this immense and profound pull that it has, because it represents this very pure and ancient observance. There aren't a lot of things that we can say we do just like our ancestors did. Even we, the most traditional, or part of the overall block of the most traditional Jews, we acknowledge that modernity exists, right? We drove before the holiday started. We drove to shul. We're going to go home. We're going to sit in our air-conditioned homes, right? We're not Amish. But when we're in the act of prayer, we can pray the exact same ways that our ancestors did. And that's what we're trying to achieve. That's the, forgive the vulgar, that is the vibe that that we're going for with the Rosh Hashanah service.
So before we wrap up, and I have asked people if they have questions. We don't have a ton of people watching because
a little niche.
It's a selective appeal.
Yeah.
Mike, why the 2 days? Why the 2 days?
If you wanted to drive people off the street, this would be the way to do it. But here's the deal, okay? Behind me, you can see my Jewish calendar. My
Long Beach calendar.
It is the Masifta of Long Beach, the calendar they send out to big donors like myself.
And myself.
$180 a year. But the Jewish calendar is a little funny because it didn't used to look like this. We didn't used to have a calendar which started on a given date and ended on a given date. We always observed a lunar calendar, but what used to happen was when there was a Sanhedrin, when there was a great rabbinical council. And that doesn't just, there are a lot of rabbinical councils today that think of themselves as being very great, but what I'm referring to is the actual Sanhedrin, which sat in the temple and was the major religious authority, and it was the absolute authority. It had the power to do capital punishment. It was the centralized rabbinic authority. They would, based on the observances of the cycles of the moon, when there was a new moon, they would declare it to be the beginning of the Jewish month, which is roughly every 30 days. And this is a very, very complex art, which involved a lot of lost astronomy, things that no one knows how to do anymore. Because of that, the only way you knew what day it was of the month was if a rider came from Jerusalem and said, well, the Sanhedrin has declared it the new month. So if it's the month of Elul, whenever the Sanhedrin declares it the month of Elul, that's when Elul is. The problem with that is eventually, especially after the destruction of the first temple, a major, major portion of the Jewish community found itself in Babylon, modern day Iran. Iran and Iraq, by the way. It should be noted that Iraq is not a real state. It was invented in the 20th century. Historically, that region meant many different things to the people who actually lived there. And we're talking about a portion which kind of lies in between, it straddles Iran and Iraq, and it is known as Bavel or Babylonian. Many Jews, probably millions of Jews ultimately end up there. And a great deal of Jewish history is tied up with Persia and Babylonia. What happens is, here's the thing, you can saddle your fastest camel, but you cannot get from Jerusalem to Babylonia fast enough for there to be a stable calendar in Jerusalem, over in Babylonia. And so there was always a certain delay. There was a certain extent to which there was at least a day's delay in getting the news over. And there was a whole system of semaphores, of waving torches from hilltop to hilltop, a little very Lord of the Rings. But it was very difficult to communicate fast enough whether the new month has started. And what that basically meant is that frequently in Babylonia, they weren't sure whether to start the new month yet, and they would have to wait a day. And so they would observe 2 days as potentially being the beginning of the new month. In other words, maybe really the new month started today, but maybe it'll only start tomorrow. And what that means is that during that time, at any given date on the Jewish calendar, it was like, yeah, well, maybe it's today, but it might also be yesterday. We don't know. I'm sorry if that sounds confusing. It's because it is. It's very difficult for us to conceive of. Calendars don't work this way anymore. Now, once the Jewish people returned to the land of Israel and the beginning of the Second Temple period, so there was basically a split. Half the Jewish people was observing this calendar, which included what's known in Aramaic as the Sveika Diyoima, we don't know what day it is. And then the Jews in the land of Israel were observing that we do know what day it is. What eventually happens is, because of the complexity and all the astronomical stuff that's associated with this, one of the great Second Temple rabbinic figures, Hillel HaZaken, Hillel the Elder, he says, enough of that. That's too complicated, and we don't know if we're going to be able to sustain that long term. And so he does, and there's the people who are good at this, and that's not me, can tell you just what a brilliant and immense project this is. But basically, he sets in stone the Jewish calendar. He puts in place the calculations, which basically enable us to calculate the calendar from here on all the way till infinity.
And the amazing thing about it is there are these rules about certain holidays can never be allowed to fall out on certain days of the week, and they don't.
Or it never falls on Shabbos.
It's
period.
phenomenal. Phenomenal.
It is immensely complex, and just the beginning of these sorts of conversation makes my eyes glaze over. But this much I can tell you, which is that, well, then this is very interesting, because it turns out that, there's this fixed calendar. So now we can send the fixed calendar. All we have to do is write it up and send it over to Babylonia, and everyone knows what day it is. We've solved the problem. So the people of Babylonia write a letter to the sages of Israel, and they say, okay, glad you worked out this thing. What are we supposed to do now? Should we change our whole way of life? And so the sages of Israel wisely write back and they say, no, it's never a good idea to uproot something so deeply rooted. And what you should do is you should preserve minig aveseichem biyadechem. The custom of your forefathers is in your hands. You should do, right? This is what we know how to do best as Jews, right? As Jews who look back. Preserve what it is your ancestors did. That's the best heuristic with which to engage the world. Did my father do this? Did my teacher do this? That's probably what I should do. And even
if we don't feel, even if that isn't relevant for us, the way.
Even though, so this is a whole different thing, and maybe we can rant about it some other time. There's a self-fulfilling prophecy that can happen when you decide that something isn't relevant, which is that it won't be relevant. And then there's, it's like you read books, right? Books aren't relevant until you read them. Oh, every work of great literature, no one.
Wait a minute, I'm pretty sure I can tell from the cover how I should judge the book. Isn't that about right?
So nobody ever. No one ever like thought of Proust before they read it. That's not one of the options on the table. The idea of reading a book of any literary or artistic experience is give me something that I don't have yet. And if so maybe it's a little bit our fault if we make the Torah seem like just a set of rules as opposed to a entire world and a way to live life. So people say, well, rules sound hard. There are already enough rules as it is. I have to wear a mask there, and I need this shot, and it all gets a little dizzying, right? So, and I also have to make sure that I don't mix milk and meat. Leave me alone, right? But the truth of the matter is that it's much better than that. It's much deeper than that. But it's very hard to explain while standing on one foot just how much better and deeper it is. And there are things that must be experienced. I loved reading Proust, but I can't convince you here now. I can't give that over to you. The best I can do is try reading it. It's great. You'll really like it, right? That's the best I can do. So there are things that need to be experienced. And this is one of them. This is one of them, I think.
I think you're right. And having had that experience in a way that you never quite did in many respects, not the Proust actually that you did and I didn't do, but the intimidating aspect of going through Rosh Hashanah in the traditional way, in all its fullness, which I did not grow up with,
right,
was so as I say, it was intimidating. But you jump into it because you say, okay, I've made a commitment to do it, as you say, the way my forefathers did it. And there must, once I accepted that there was a good reason for them to have done it, by virtue of their being my forefathers, let me immerse myself in it and experience it.
Right.
And it took a while. It wasn't like that first Rosh Hashanah.
I can imagine, right?
Just what's going mind-boggling. Right. But eventually you get to know the songs, you get to know the prayers, you get more comfortable with the liturgy, you begin to see patterns.
And then it's nostalgic, right? Then it's like, oh, this is my favorite part. As soon as you have a favorite part, you're plugged in because it was probably your great-grandfather's favorite part too. And right? The good parts are pretty good. They're pretty universally good, The part where we go, like, God decides who will live and who will die, who will be rich and who will be poor. Everyone who's responsible for paying his bills gets a little like, okay, all right, it's on now. So did your great-grandfather. So did his great-grandfather.
And
so
Rabbi Coleman, are you going to be leading any services in reminding people of any of the good parts this year?
I will be, yes. I'm going to be leading Musaf, which is the literally means the added service. It is the service you add on a holiday, but of course the Musaf of Rosh Hashanah is a particularly gigantic added service. So I will be having that honor on the first day of Rosh Hashanah, which is obviously a humbling responsibility. I've done it before, and I feel good about doing it again. But I'm actually pretty deep in preparation. If you could see all the tabs that are open, I keep a Google Doc where I manage the various details, which again, if anyone's still on the stream, they will certainly be driven off if I start droning on about those. But
they understand, from the beginning of the stream that you can't use that Google Doc
On Rosh Hashanah, that's right. That's right. It would be printed out and tucked into my matzah. And this is, by the way, Arch Cole Matzah, not a sponsor, but
a client.
Nice. Well, anyway, yeah,
Usher, thank you for this, all these many explanations to all these important questions, for taking the time out of the evening to share it with the 14 people who are with us tonight. And of course, the live stream will be available on all the places where I make things available. So if anyone wants to harken back to it at some point, I think hopefully that they will. And we'll jack up the SEO because I think you're good at explaining things. And
probably when people are like awake and doing things in New York, I suspect that might be and not like drowning.
Drowning or dealing with a basement that is threatening to drown us. So on that note, thank you we just got to thank you for loving it, and thank you, Yisrael Usher, and to everyone. Remember, Rosh Hashanah is Monday night. We'll talk. You'll hear from me. Those of you who follow me in all kinds of ways will be reminded. And if I'm happy to ask questions, or if they're hard questions, to forward them to more knowledgeable people, such as my son or Mrs. Coleman, and about this topic. But then we're going to go back to our usual predominantly secular feed. After this broadcast. But thanks a lot, Usher. Good night, and say hi to everybody.
Thanks so much. Thanks for the opportunity. Have a wonderful night.